Hi everyone, welcome back for another episode of Adventures in Eagle Territory. My name is Becky and I'm back for another episode, this time to teach you a little bit about tree identification. It is Arbor Day, but it's also still spring. So the primary method that we are going to be using to identify these trees today is by looking at the tree bark. So this first tree that I'm going to show you is going to kind of get us warmed up because it's fairly distinctive. You can see that it is very white and papery, and so therefore this is a paper birch tree. Now, oftentimes if I have a hard time identifying a tree by looking at the bark at the base, closer to the base of the tree, I will actually try to look higher up in the tree and see what the bark looks like on some of the younger growth. And that will often have some bark on it that is a little bit more distinctive, whereas the older bark might actually be getting kind of hard to, be losing some of the characteristics that are going to help me identify this tree. Paper birch this time of year are also going to have these flowers on them called catkins. Now these little dangly flowers are full of pollen, and so when the wind blows and moves those branches around, it's going to help pollinate these trees. And paper birch are a very important source of food and habitat for a lot of wildlife, specifically related to birds. The seeds of the paper birch are very small and papery, and in the wintertime, they're a really good food source for black-capped chickadees. And the paper birch tree happens to be one of the favorite trees of the yellow-bellied sapsucker, which will drill these little holes called Sap Wells into the tree and then be able to get at that sap for nourishment. And it's really unique how the yellow-bellied sapsucker actually creates these sap wells in very distinct straight rows. And after they've already used the holes, then hummingbirds can actually come and also use the sap that could be left over in those holes or leaking out of those holes as well. Another tree that has some fairly distinct bark, but might be a little bit harder because now we're getting into that very grayish, brownish colored bark. And but this tree still has some really distinct characteristics for us to look at. If you'll notice, there's a lot of very warty texture to this bark, and it also has a very cork-like texture. The feeling of it is, it feels a lot, it has a little bit of squish to it, so it feels a little bit like cork. And this tree is called a hackberry tree. It's kind of strange, but I like to remember this tree because the bark kind of looks like something that a cat might hack up. That's how I remember it. And this tree, the hackberry tree, is very tolerant to all sorts of conditions like heat, drought, salt, wind, ice, and even some short-term flooding. So because of those characteristics, that makes this a really great tree for boulevards or for tree lawns lining people's yards along the road, because of course there's going to be a lot of salt put on those roads in the wintertime. The gutters could possibly flood in the spring and summertime, and there's just going to be a whole lot of issues with soil and things that could make growing trees on tree lawns very difficult. But the hackberry tree actually happens to be very well adapted to all of those circumstances. And the trees all along this boulevard or along this street are mostly hackberry trees. Now, the hackberry is also a very important food source for birds and even some small mammals. It does have these greenish yellow fruit that ripen to purple in the fall, and those fruit actually stay on the tree throughout most of the winter. So it's a really important food source for a lot of different types of birds. And then those fruit will also produce those little round seeds. So far we've looked at a couple of trees that have some very distinct characteristics in their bark. But now let's take this identification to the next level. This is a tree that at first glance just looks like every other tree in the woods. It has that very grayish brown bark, but there are some things about this particular tree that are really unique. So I'm not going to tell you what it is yet. We're going to walk through this together and see if we can figure it out together. So this particular tree that I'm showing you is very unique in one very important way, in that it has opposite branching. So the branches coming off the parent branch come off of grow directly opposite off that branch from one another. And you can see that in the branching. You can also see that in the buds that form on the branches. And there are very few trees that are actually have this type of growth pattern. And the acronym that I use to help me remember which trees have opposite branching is MAD Dog. So MAD Dog stands for Maple, Ash, Dogwood. So maybe by the process of elimination, we can figure out what type of tree this is, because it does have opposite branching. That really narrows down the possibilities for us. Now, that tree bark is actually going to look a lot like shakebark hickory or like oak, but both of these species of trees actually have alternate branching. So we know just by looking at that growth pattern that we are not looking at a shagbark hickory or an oak tree, and that eliminates a lot of possibilities for us. Now, remember that acronym MAD Dog. One of the species that can have opposite branching is an ash tree. And the bark of an ash tree has very diamond-shaped patterns or grooves throughout it, kind of like somebody maybe took a knife and made slices all over the tree. But that doesn't really look like the tree that we're looking at right now. So it's not an ash, no diamond pattern in the bark, no diamond grooves in the bark. Now, Mad Dog, another possibility is going to be dogwood. And dogwood trees, or flowering dogwood, have squarish scales that kind of look like alligator scales, kind of looks like your skin if it would be under a magnifying glass or a telescope, and you could see the scales peeling away. And there are a lot of other species of dogwood, and some of them are shrubs. So looking back at the tree that we're trying to identify, I don't see any squarish scales. There are scales, but they're not tiny little flakes or squares like the dogwood. And this is definitely not a shrub, so we can easily answer that question. This is definitely a tree, fortunately. So that leaves our last option, using Mad Dog and the opposite branching pattern, which the last option is going to be that this is a maple tree. So there are many different species of maple trees. There's around 128 different species of maple, and in Minnesota there are probably around 5 native species of maple. The bark is fairly variable among species, and when the trees are very young, the bark can actually be quite smooth. And as these trees get older, they start to develop these grooves or fissures in the bark that are eventually going to start peeling away and flaking away from the tree. And don't forget to look for that opposite branching pattern. When I'm trying to identify a tree, that's usually one of the first things that I'm going to do, is look for what that branching pattern, and whether it's opposite or alternate. So I think we have our tree. It's definitely a maple tree. And to kind of try and figure out what species it is, that's going to get even more advanced, and it's probably going to be difficult for us to go into too much detail with the time we have for this video today. But this particular maple tree does have some buds on it that are reddish buds, which is probably true for a lot of different maples. But this particular tree is starting to bud or flower very early in the spring. I know that it already has some of these buds on it. And so I think that we're actually looking at a silver maple tree that, again, blooms very early in the spring with these tiny little flowers that are often hard to notice because the bud scales often cover up the flowering part of it. So thanks again for joining me today for this episode of Adventures in Eagle Territory. I want to wish everybody a very happy Arbor Day, and we'll look forward to seeing you again for another episode of Adventures in Eagle Territory.